Chapter 10. Applause. Richard was having a difficult time at the library. He began scanning the bookshelves for a second time and was becoming frustrated when Michelle offered, "Let's do something different." Richard knew by the way Michelle was smiling that she already had something in mind. "What?" he asked, knowing that a new adventure was about to begin. "People," she answered. They walked past the librarian at the checkout desk empty-handed for the first time in over a year and started toward the east end of town. There wasn't much out there. "The rest home?" Richard asked. "People," Michelle repeated while allowing Richard to open the door for her. Michelle started with a man hunched over on a chair in the entry. She said a few words to get him talking, then sat down next to him and listened. Richard stood by her side, watching in amazement. After sincerely thanking him for his time, Michelle walked into an open doorway halfway down the hall where she began visiting with a disabled woman that had once been an actress. Michelle had a way of asking just the right questions to bring out the exciting or inspiring events in each of their lives. They even told her of their secret loves and desires. Richard and Michelle visited the retirement center every other Saturday during the next school year, and as the weeks passed, they found themselves the center of attention. All they had to do was say a few words, then listen while becoming their dearest friends. Even though many of the residents had lived together for years, they all learned new things about each other that brought them closer together. The staff couldn't believe how miraculously the atmosphere changed for the better, and Richard was amazed at how many stories of adventure and glory were just waiting to be discovered from people to whom he had never given a second thought. And best of all, we can hear the stories from the real people who were actually there and lived it, Michelle explained between the two trees one Saturday afternoon. Richard enjoyed the visits, but Michelle was passionate about them. Even during the next summer, when there were so many other places to go and things to do, they kept going back. It was that summer that they made it their ritual to pull weeds outside the retirement center, then give a flower to the first person they talked to. Michelle had a special way with people, also an imagination that never quit. After swimming in the lake on lazy afternoons, they would walk across the bridge and lay down on the grassy knoll so they could look up at the sky. With the freedom to talk about anything, their imaginations soared. If there were clouds floating by, Michelle told Richard that they were animals or storybook people. Richard responded by telling her about his own observations, which were usually much more serious. Then Michelle would always add some comment that made him laugh until it hurt. Every time a jet crossed the sky, they talked about traveling the world together. Sometimes they even spoke of love and marriage, though they never talked in first person or about each other specifically. But on the hot afternoons when they became drowsy and fell asleep, they always dreamed about each other and no one else. Richard was 15 and a half, and Michelle almost 14. It was late in the summer, but still a hot afternoon when they placed their clothes on their bicycles and walked down to the shore. They tossed their towels on the dock like they had 100 times before, and Richard glanced over at Michelle. Even though it was the second swimming suit that she had owned since they met, it was still one piece and dark blue. Michelle could tell that Richard still remembered her words, and she smiled. Richard smiled back. Regardless of what Michelle was wearing, she had become a beautiful young woman, and Richard knew it. And best of all, she was still his best friend. With a wink, Michelle gracefully climbed the highest post and executed a perfect 1.5 flip with a twist. Even though it was her first dive of the day, she entered the water without the slightest splash. Later that afternoon, when they were putting their shoes back on between the two trees, Michelle asked, "Will you bring your violin tomorrow?" Richard was reluctant, but felt that he couldn't refuse her anything. He puffed up his chest and lifted his chin. "Of course, madam, your wish is my command." "Richard wants to take his Bergonzi to the retirement center tomorrow," Elaine told George later that night at the dinner table. George cleared his throat, signifying that he was deeply concerned. "What for?" he asked. "Michelle wants him to play some music." "That sounds like a nice thing to do, but can't Richard take his spare practice violin?" Richard replied, "It doesn't sound half as good as the Bergonzi, and Michelle really likes the people there." Michelle, don't you think you're spending a little too much time with that girl?" Richard wasn't sure how to respond. It wasn't the first time the topic had come up, but it was his father's most direct assault so far. When Richard hesitated, George added, "Your mother also tells me that your practicing has been slipping." George finished by clearing his throat and giving Richard another look. Richard knew that he had been pushing the limit during the previous couple months. He had been spending almost every waking moment with Michelle, and even though his music studies were progressing, they had slowed to a crawl. He knew that he needed to come up with something if he expected to keep spending time with Michelle. "If I play at the rest home, it'll help my performing skills. My teacher told me just last week that I needed to perform more in front of audiences." George studied Richard's earnest expression. "Well, I suppose that's true, but we still need to talk about the amount of time you two are spending together." Before George could say any more, Elaine added, "Don't carry it on your bicycle, and don't go anywhere else. Bring it straight home." George nodded, and the family finished their meal in silence. The next morning, Richard arrived between the two trees just before Michelle. He was holding the Bergonzi in his lap, and Michelle sauntered toward him, carrying a thin paper bag that didn't appear to have anything in it. After putting their bare feet together, Michelle said, "Thank you," with a twinkle in her eye. Richard smiled back. "What's in the bag?" "A surprise for later." After wiggling their toes, Richard got serious. "Last night, my parents commented about us spending too much time together and about my practicing." "I've been thinking about that," Michelle replied in her simple way. Without another word, they put their shoes back on and started toward the east end of town. Everyone's eyes lit up as soon as Michelle and Richard appeared in the doorway. They all pointed at the violin case in Richard's hand and talked excitedly. Michelle had told them how wonderfully he could play, though Richard thought that she had exaggerated a bit. Everyone formed a ragged circle, some of them in wheelchairs, while the others filled the sofas and recliners. Without any introduction, Richard rosined up his bow, pulled out his violin, and began playing. The pieces he chose to play were from his last lesson, and they were quite difficult. Richard played flawlessly, and when he finished, he received a warm round of applause. Some even cheered, and those that could gave him a standing ovation. Richard was about to put his violin away when Michelle stepped forward with the thin paper bag. "Please play this," she whispered, while pulling out a piece of sheet music. She held it up with both hands because Richard had not brought a music stand. It was a simple love song. Everyone in the retirement center began crying after the first few bars. It was as if each and every one of them were reliving their fondest memories. They watched Michelle and Richard together and began holding hands. Others put their head on the shoulder next to them and wept uncontrollably. Halfway through the song, Richard watched as people who had never left their rooms began coming into the entry from down the hall, while those who couldn't get there on their own were summoning the front desk for assistance. "Again?" Michelle requested when the song was over and people were still arriving in the foyer. Richard didn't need the music the second time, and he played it from memory while looking into Michelle's eyes. He found himself thinking of the day they first met and all the things they had experienced together. He began playing every note of music with more feeling and expression than he ever had before. When the song was finished, everyone in the room was weeping. Every face wore a smile, and every eye glistened long after the final note had died away. Their silent tears of joy were the loudest applause Richard had ever heard, and he quietly put his violin away and closed the lid without saying a word. Michelle slid the music back into the brown paper bag and whispered, "Thank you," while Richard held the door for her. Then they silently walked away, side by side. After reaching the sidewalk and turning toward the park, Richard finally looked down. Michelle was holding his hand.